938 Live, this is Talkback.
Thanks for joining us on Talkback on 938 Live. I'm Bharati Jagdish with Justine Moss. Now, a politically proactive Singaporean society, not run only by party politics. Now, this was something that was raised in a commentary in the Today newspaper yesterday. The author, Pravin Prakash, who will be joining us in a moment, certainly thinks so. It is possible to do this. With a growing political and social consciousness, Singaporeans, it seems, are seeking greater discourse and debate over issues that concern them. I'm sure many of you listening in would agree. Now, Pravin raised the examples of the reactions over the population white paper, the heated debate over the pink dot and wear white movements, as well as the furore over the National Library Board's decision to withdraw 3 book titles. And he thinks that these discussions were not influenced by partisan politics. Instead, they reflect a ground-up mobilization that has almost zero electoral ambition. Now, all these responses and reactions that we are seeing from Singaporeans is obviously characteristic of a population that is increasingly vocal, increasingly conscious of social issues as well, displaying strong opinions about what is considered to be acceptable norms and values. Also might indicate a citizenry that increasingly wants to exercise its right to lobby the government of the day over contentious issues and policies. So maybe now to say that Singaporeans are apolitical may not be quite accurate.
So can we be interested in policy and political issues without necessarily making it an electoral issue? Have you done so recently, and why? And how prepared are our civil society groups in developing an engaged and constructive society that is able to make its voice heard in policy making in Singapore? What is the role of the government in engaging or even developing civil society? Will an active civil society also help develop active Singaporeans who may later on see the usefulness in participating in actual electoral politics? Is this perhaps one way to encourage younger Singaporeans to eventually step up and serve in government? Well, in the studio with us is Dr. Gillian Koh, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and also on the line with us, as well as the writer of the article, The Evolution of Modern Singapore's Civil Society, in the Today paper, Pravin Prakash. But first, Gillian, to start us off, give us a quick assessment of where civil society stands now in Singapore compared to, say, 10 or 15 years ago.
Well, let's go further back. Let's talk about the formation of AWARE, which is a non-government organization that looks at gender rights. And that organization was formed in opposition to a government's sort of policy called the Graduate Mother Policy, which was later sort of overturned. And it stemmed from a desire to contest that government policy. So I think in the mid-80s, you saw a lot of NGOs popping up in order to contest what was government policy. And then government, in turn, seeing that sort of energy as sort of being adversarial to government policy. And there were sort of some unhappy sort of engagement between government and civil society. But many, many years hence, we've seen even AWARE making a lot of headway on government policy, on changing legislation. You've seen that in terms of how rape victims are no longer considered the perpetrators of crime, but treated with dignity and as victims. And today, or last year, we've seen sort of very successful advocacy on the issue of harassment. And the government's now introduced
an anti-harassment law.
Anti-harassment bill that covers a lot of things, including sexual harassment and harassment that can come online. And this is just one story of how you see the engagement move from just taking on the government to, sort of being engaged by the government with their views incorporated, changing legislation, and really we all feel, for the better of Singapore society.
Let's bring Pravin here. Pravin, you talked about in your article how some time ago it was seen as if political groups, or rather, you couldn't get involved in political issues and discussing political issues unless you were a politician yourself. And you cite several examples, including the Catherine Lim example, writer Catherine Lim, who wrote a critical essay in 1994. And in reply, the Prime Minister's office stated then that novelists, short story writers, and theatre groups would not be allowed to set the political agenda from outside the political arena. To what extent do you think all of this has changed? After all, talking about political issues, commenting on them, expressing your views on them, isn't really always an attempt to set the political agenda, is it?
Exactly. I mean, the Catherine Lim issue, which was in 1994, I think, if we can just use Catherine Lim as a case study, like Catherine Lim's article in 1994 met with a lot of opposition from the PAP, while an equally just as critical article right after the 2011 elections did not meet with as much criticism. They disagreed, but they were willing to talk about it. And in fact, there wasn't much engagement on the part of the PAP. It was more of a public debate that took place after her article. That in itself shows that there is a pretty distinctive shift from 1994.
Tell us what really led you to write this piece. Clearly, this is something you do feel strongly about.
Okay, well, there are two things that led to it. I follow civil society with a pretty keen interest, partially because my research for my master's dictates that I do, but also because I feel that the real shift in politics in Singapore is the fundamental idea of what politics is, and that it isn't. In Singapore, we have always had this impression that politics is about political parties. This is partially led by the party, the governing party itself, but to a large extent, I think Singaporeans have always, sort of refrained from talking about the word politics simply because they think it's about partisan politics. But today, I think there is increasing awareness that an active citizenry has an active part to play in politics, and that this does not necessarily infringe into partisan politics, that there is political space in civil society.
When we talk about civil society and active citizens playing an active part, it is also the texture of that interaction that is important, isn't it? It's not just about speaking up. It's about speaking up more constructively as well. Perhaps, Gillian, you could assess, based on what's been happening in the last few years, how that discourse has been shaping up. Is this also promoting a more mature, maybe more politically aware society?
Well, I think if you look at the history of, say, nature society, I mean, it's constituted by citizens, right? Concerned citizens. And you've seen that they've been very successful in engaging the government on several sort of occasions, including having a moratorium on the redevelopment of Chek Jawa. So we've kept that habitat and or Sungai Below well before that. So I think we've had a tradition where citizens do engage in policy, but in sort of interacting with the government, that's politics involved. But that tradition is very much based on research, on demonstrating you have a special expertise as well as interest in that area. What we've seen sort of today, and Bharati, you cited the white paper protests, is a mixture of people who are of that nature, from that tradition. They sort of do the research, try to understand the issues, as well as ordinary citizens who just have an opinion and share it. So you have sort of, it's more vociferous, more exciting, more interesting, more diverse, and then go right out to the online space, and you see that there's also that range. Right? So citizens just giving their opinion, as well as sort of groups and public intellectuals sort of coming up with their very thoughtful views. So yes, you do have that range. The most important thing is that if you do want to discuss not just policy development, but really say, let's take on the government, then what we do demand as citizens ourselves is that you declare what your intent is. Now, you declare it by registering. You declare it by saying so. You can be a citizen offering views, but if you come to a point where you actually say, well, you know, the PAP government should really be turned out by XYZ, then you will be construed as a public movement. And there is a rule where, say, in case of the Online Citizen, you will be construed as a political association, so that everybody will understand that you have become a political association. So if you're a giraffe, don't tell me that you're a donkey when you're actually a giraffe. Declare that you're a giraffe, right?
Well, that has not been taken to very kindly by a lot of people. That, you know,
Well, there
why
should
do
be
we
no
have to?
deception.
Yeah. What do
There
you
should
think,
be no
Pravin?
deception.
What do you think of what Gillian just said?
Well, I think that I think she's very right in pointing out exactly how civil society has evolved in Singapore, and I think it's important that we place that in context. Because, I mean, it's easy to say, well, this is not acceptable. Let's go back to let's radically change everything. But nothing in politics changes radically, and radical change always brings about a high level of discomfort. So, looking at the trajectory of how civil society has grown, I think we can. It's more beneficial to talk about how it can evolve further, and I think that it will become less clear where politics is involved and where society is involved. What is social and
But
what's
what
political.
about making it clear what your intentions are? So, in other words, if you're going to comment on politics, you register as such.
Well,
It did not go down too well with several quarters when that was mentioned. To what extent do you think, though, it is a reasonable expectation?
I think I've always been a big advocate of accountability, in the sense that I have never written a piece in which I have not put my name in it. Whether this has been on my blog or whether it's been in articles I've written, I've always listed my name, and that's because I don't think one needs to shy away from having an opinion if it's constructive. But at the same time, I think it's tricky because there is a difference between state, government, and party. So I think someone can have a critical view of politics in Singapore without necessarily having a partisan interest. And I think that's where the critique lies. I could be critical of the government without having a political bias myself. I do not wish that this party or this party comes to power. I just wish that certain issues are addressed by those in power. So it's
for the good of everyone else, or for the good of a certain quarter in society, a particular quarter of society. Thank you so much. Stay with us on 938 Live. We do want to hear from you. We're talking all about active citizenry, so come on, get active now. We'll speak to you, David, right after news and sports. And if you're listening in and haven't called in yet, our number is 669-11938. A politically proactive Singaporean society not run by party politics. To what extent is this possible? Discussions that are not influenced by partisan politics, instead reflecting a ground-up mobilization that has almost zero electoral ambition. We've seen some examples of this in recent years. How can more space be made for the growth of civil society? Why should more space be made? We're joined today by Dr. Gillian Koh, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and Pravin Prakash. He's a master's student of political science at the National University of Singapore. He recently wrote a commentary piece, The Evolution of Modern Singapore's Civil Society, in the Today newspaper. Thanks for joining us. Now, Pravin, recently, former nominated Member of Parliament Janice Koh had said that the government should unlearn its instincts of wanting to draw more boundaries for civic discourse. She had said that the government should grow the space for public debate and facilitate civic discourse. Now, you talk about space too, but you mentioned the expansion of political space in Singapore in the past few years. Can you first of all explain what you mean by political space in the context of civil society?
Well, I actually kind of use it quite interchangeably. I define political space in civil society as just being a sort of social political consciousness that exists within people. So any sort of discussion regarding national issues or regarding society at large within civic society or civil society, between people, between groups, is political in nature, because it thinks about how our society should be, how it can change, and how it can be better. This is politics. It's not, politics should not be confined to just debates in Parliament or between political parties. What we're having right now, you, me, and Julian, this is politics.
Let's talk about Janice's suggestion that the government should grow the space for public debate and facilitate this civic discourse. In fact, just her mentioning the government's instincts of wanting to draw more boundaries for civic discourse, I think indicates that perhaps there is doubt about whether the government is into growing the space for public debate. Your views on that?
Yes, I think there is doubt, and I think that's only natural given the history of somewhat paternalist government that we have. That doubt exists. I agree with Janice, and I think, but only difference is I think I just want to rephrase it a little bit. I think that the government should allow for space, and we, the public sphere, we should grow the space ourselves. So the government has got no responsibility to grow the space for us. They should allow for the space. And we have the responsibility to let it grow in a responsible manner.
Okay, and we'll talk about how we can do this as active citizens in just a moment. Let's speak with David first. Maybe David's got a suggestion. Hi, David. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. I think this is a very complex issue, but I've been observing how it has evolved, especially in all the recent cases about the pink dot and all the various infiltrations into some of the society. I think one hand is that the evolve of a generation where they are still very interested in politics and the interest of the country, but they've been spending all their life working just to make a living, and they've come of age where this is no longer a key item for them, and they're beginning to be awakened and a wish to speak out, not so much for their livelihood, but really for something that has been with them for all this while. And on the other side, you have the fashionable, the younger generation that's been very much educated in a different era, of which their exposure is very exposed to what is maybe the Western culture or the most popular culture. So you're seeing, especially in the recent case, and especially with the people around me that I speak to, there is an awakening of this generation in the 40s and the 50s where they've passed, the family has grown up, the children has grown up. And it begins to want to voice out really from what matters to them, matters to around them, where they used to unable to because they really focus is on the bread and butter issues.
Right, and self maybe.
Exactly. And so there's these two, I can't put it in the words, this growing of these two particular things, and I think it is getting momentum, not so much for politics.
Do you see this as a positive thing, David?
I think it is a very positive thing, but I think if it's not managed properly, it can be exploited. Just like on one hand, the younger generation could be influenced by what they hear that's fashionable. On the other hand, there's this growing frustration with these generations that if it is not managed or communicated properly, could be exploited to use it politically.
All right, let's discuss that for a moment. Pravin, your views on that? Potential exploitation of issues to further other people's agendas.
Okay, I think that he's right in the sense that there is a different sort of thought process that is evolving amongst a younger generation. But I think being critical is something that it's not limited by which generation you're from.
Yes.
I think we've got this idea that the older Singaporeans are only concerned with bread and butter issues, and younger Singaporeans are more, because we haven't seen the ways of the world, we feel that, we can talk about all these, airy-fairy things. I think that's not necessarily true. I think an interest in politics or civil discontent or whatever you want to call it, it exists across generations. And I think the desire to speak exists across generations as well. And we've got this, we shouldn't...
But how to manage discourse in a way that is constructive and perhaps broadens people's perspectives of real issues rather than, have other groups infiltrate the discourse and use it for their own means, exploit it for their own furtherance of their own political agenda.
That's sort of the problem, isn't it? I mean, with anything in Singapore, we tend to obsess over the need to manage like even in our conversation, we keep using the word manage, like as though a population needs to be mollycoddled and taught how to think or how to write or how to speak. Like right now, we're managing a perfectly proper conversation without being told how to do so. I haven't been given any instructions on how to have a conversation.
Right. So you're saying leave it to the citizens, which brings me to another point. Also something that Janice Koh, former NMP, had mentioned in a speech, censoring or restricting films, plays, all of these seek to examine complex issues in our society. And if we censor, it's actually tantamount to cutting off space for constructive civic discourse. To what extent would you agree with that? That's a little more complex, right?
Yes, it's a lot more complex. But at the same time, I'm going back to exactly what I said earlier, which is that I think it needs to work both ways, right? The government needs to put a little bit more trust in the fact that we are capable of reading or writing, or more than writing, reading or listening or watching something and being able to critically examine it ourselves. I think we are not easily convinced by anything, which I think is true for most of the population. We would not take anything at face value. We are capable of critically examining it. And at the same time, the reason why this doubt exists is because we're talking about a maturing civil society, and I think there is a lot of starting trouble as well. Like, I think there's a tendency to run straight back to the government whenever things don't go our way, right? I think Walter Woon has called this a sort of brat complex, and that exists in the sense that we are okay with having a discussion. If something doesn't go our way, we go straight back to the government and say,
fix it.
Could you please,
fix it. In other words, let's bring Gillian back into this. Gillian, Pravin mentioned earlier that we as active citizens need to grow civic space for ourselves. How can this be done?
Well, I think, as has been discussed, this is going to be quite spontaneous. But as we also said, the 20-year, 25-year record of how civil society has developed here has been through many of these phases. And you see that the more sort of successful groups, those that are successful not just in terms of shaping policy, but held, in high regard by citizens, is that they do it in an informed manner. They take a certain tone. They therefore, it's tone, it's substance, and it's what is the outcome that you want, and you're guided by that. So when we talk about managing, the whole situation, yes, the government's tried to say, let's see whether we can help you regulate. But I think the onus is on people and civil society to also talk about what are the norms that should guide us. And those norms should be fundamentally based on the idea of civility. Yeah. So we can disagree, but we must learn to disagree agreeably and to tolerate and to feel that the whole point of it is to really discuss what is the common good.
I understand that, but to what extent do you think we're really shying away, or the government has talked about how divisive debate is not really the only solution, and perhaps divisiveness isn't the way to go. But debate can be sometimes divisive. It can be sometimes time-consuming. It can be inconvenient.
Yeah, I think you can go ahead and shout, but I'm not sure that many people will listen, and they will also shout back. So it's something that we know we do in the playground or elsewhere, and we know that if we want to be heard, then we actually have to be respectful. We also have to show our substance in our
To what extent do you think, and this has been suggested before, that kids in school need some form of political education as well, so that they can grow up to be more active and constructive members of civic society?
Well, I mean, just as Ravin has talked about it, political can cover a lot of things. So I think what we are talking about is just training all of us up, whether students or adults, to have civil debates, ability to hold a conversation and take the other's perspective, and then say that the outcome is that we should all learn to be more understanding of our common situation.
What do you think, Pravin? A little too managed or not? Or is this what we need, you think?
I think you talked about education, right? I'll just mention a little bit about that because it's kind of my pet peeve. I think that it's a bit of a tragedy that a lot of Singaporean students come to the university, and it is there that they have a little bit of education into what Singapore's politics is like. I think we do a good job of teaching our history. We do a good job of teaching, what our society is encompasses and all of this. But we do not. How many students actually know, or how many people in Singapore actually know what our constitution is about? How many of us actually know what our political system is made up of? Right.
And this is all important towards actually educating an individual to be able to talk about issues in an educated manner.
We exist within structures and institutions.
Pravin, a quick question, Pravin. Why is it so important to grow civic discourse? At the end of the day, why is it so important?
Because we cannot expect, how to say this? Okay. As our society gets more educated, as it gets more opinionated, we need to understand that we're not going to always agree with the discourse provided by the government. We are going to disagree, and like Gillian said, we need to learn how to agree to disagree. We got to learn how to understand that the purpose of discourse is not to come to a definite conclusion. Sometimes it's just to understand why we're disagreeing.
Thank you very much. That's well said. And indeed, to some extent, also feed into policy issues. Thank you so much, Pravin Prakash, for joining us today. Master student of Political Science from the National University of Singapore. In the studio with us, many thanks to Dr. Gillian Koh, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies. Thanks for joining us on Talkback.